This session is about systems thinking, so an integrated approach to thinking about how we might farm in the future on the Fens. And a systems approach is crucial to identify that word mosaic of land management practices for lowland agricultural peatland, because it allows for a comprehensive understanding of the complex interactions between land, water, biodiversity and climate. So a systems approach also provides the flexibility which we think we need to address the diverse challenges posed by lowland agricultural peatlands. These landscapes vary greatly in terms of hydrology, soil types, socioeconomic conditions, and also how farmers can manage their water tables. So I think we need to think now about mosaics of practice and thinking about changing environmental conditions, policy shifts, and market demands. So Megan, you're going first.
Yeah, sorry, me again, everybody. So in this session, obviously, we're focusing on the landscape approach to managing peat. So I'm going to talk through a quick progress report on our opportunity mapping work that we've been doing. So this work is work that I'm presenting on behalf of myself and Elizabeth Stockdale, who I originally did the work with, and then we've since expanded out to other sort of areas within the Fens. So we're looking at using local expert knowledge to co-design catchment scale lowland agricultural peat management opportunities. So in terms of the background, obviously I've covered a lot of this off this morning, so I'll skip over this one a little bit, but we've seen significant loss of peat in the Fens over the last sort of 40-year period. So in 1987 we had about 24,000 hectares of peat left, with an even greater extent of peaty soils. Now we're not exactly sure how much we've got left, but we know it's a lot less than that. Just from having conversations quite early on in sort of the Fenland soil, sort of setting up Fenland soil, it became really quickly clear that talking to farmers, talking to people that had kind of been in the Fens for a long time, that actually our fen soils had changed significantly in that period. And just using that sort of local expert knowledge, we could see that actually what we were seeing in terms of the peat map, in terms of the existing mapping that we'd got, was far out of date, and we needed to come up with something new to replace that and actually give us a more up-to-date picture and a much clearer picture of where we're starting from today in terms of our extent of lowland peat. So what even is local soils knowledge? So local soils knowledge is the knowledge of soil properties and management that's held by people that live and work on that soil for a long period of time. It's used quite extensively in other parts of the world, but actually in the UK it's something that's quite underused in terms of understanding land use. So we've used it, and it can be integrated into participatory soil surveys, which provide sort of more context-appropriate solutions to managing land. So back in 2020, in the COVID era, I think most of this was actually done online rather than in person, Liz started working with farms to understand how we can integrate local soils knowledge to better understand soils in the Fens. She found that most farms had really detailed records of their soils, and actually had really long family memories as well of what had changed and what had altered over time. So initially, she did kind of an in-depth focus with 11 farms to understand the lexicon is what we're calling it, but basically the terminology that each farm uses to sort of explain its soils and describe its soils. So this is kind of an example of what she came up with. So she went and sat down with Farmer Reid, talked through all of the different soil types that we had, and basically this is what he came up with. So you can see kind of you've got your deep black peat over clay. It's that kind of terminology. It's the kind of stuff that you'd use talking around a kitchen table or at the pub, rather than the really complicated stuff that soil scientists often use. So this is what we kind of went with in terms of describing your soils in order to start looking forward at mapping. We then ended up with loads of these different lexicons that we needed to align. And yeah, there's no way I could ever get to that point where you could read it. But basically, these are all of the different soil terminologies that we found doing this project, and how they've all sort of aligned up with each other, and we've got sort of some agreement between all of the different farmers over what they call certain things. And that's allowed us to develop, and we then worked with them to map their own farms using that terminology. And that's allowed us to develop, somewhere, there we go, I've got my slides out of order. That's allowed us to develop basically this common lexicon that covers all the different soil types that we see across the Fens. So, kind of looking at this, we've got 36 different soil types that we've identified so far. I think actually during the course of the project this year it's gone up to 37 because we found a new one whilst we were out mapping in one of the IDVs that we've worked with this year. And these are basically sort of in farmer speak the different terminologies that we use to describe soils. So the deep purple stuff at the top, there are really deep peat soils over the different subsoils. As we grade down into sort of the purpley pink stuff, that's where we're starting to get to sort of our shallow peats, our quite degraded peats, and then it heads into our sort of organo-mineral and then mineral soils. So that's great, but how do we actually use that to map soils, and how do we use that sort of going forward? So what we've done, these are completely out of order, sorry. What we've done is we've worked with farms to basically do some colouring in and get farms to sit down with us and talk us through what different soils they've got where. And they've basically covered in that soil map, they've told us using that terminology what they've got where, and then we've been able to translate that back into soil science terminology to use that to generate some new peat maps. So farms have gone along at field scale and they've told us what soils they've got, what sort of subsoils they've got, and what subsets within that. And then we've digitised that up into whole drainage board maps that we can use to get a better estimate of what different soils we've got where in terms of extensive peat. We've then used that alongside data also gathered from farms on yield and productivity and water management, which has basically been able to give us a bit of an idea of where areas are and where hotspots are for production within the Fens, which I'm sure, as you can gather from the presentation we heard earlier, is a fair area of it. But also where the sort of less productive pockets of land are, which might be the ideal candidates for alternative management and different mitigations in terms of land management practices. So these are an example of some of the different things that we were talking to farms about. So we had farms score every field in their farm against these metrics from 1 to 5, so they followed a guidance sheet, and it basically gave us a really clear idea of where these productive and unproductive areas were, and also where there were areas where it was potentially more or less possible to alter hydrology and manage hydrology differently. So this gives us, in the end, 3 mapping layers that we can use, and then we sort of put that into our GIS software and look at the interactions between those different layers. And that provides us with a land management opportunity map, which basically identifies areas where there's potential for restoration, alternative management, where we've got areas where actually there's enough peat that we need to be concerned about how we manage our land there, and we need to be concerned from a emissions point of view, but where actually managing a water table probably isn't the most appropriate way of achieving an outcome for that area of land, because the hydrology isn't suitable, because we've got topographical variation that makes things difficult. And then we've got some areas which is the purpley stuff, which is areas where actually business as usual is probably the best practice, probably integrating some more regenerative techniques, but basically they're areas where there isn't any peat left, the hydrology is completely inappropriate for different management, and where actually it makes more sense to be looking at employing just regenerative principles to manage that land. So it's all about generating this mosaic of different land management practices and different opportunities for the land, but using the knowledge of the farms that farm it to develop that. And then it will generate something that looks a little bit like this. So we'll have different areas of sort of conventional agriculture with regenerative practices mixed in. We'll have some areas where we're managing water tables for wetter farming, so not just polluticulture, but just raising water tables slightly to see impact there. And then there'll be areas as well where we might look at different things, so wetland creation, all of those kinds of practices as well in areas that are really unproductive or difficult to manage. And those mosaics may not stay in place over time, they might move around in terms of new evidence that we find or changes to hydrology that mean that we can continue to sort of review that mosaic and make sure that we've got the most appropriate land management practices in place for the soils that we've got. So in terms of where we've got to with it, The initial pilot area that we did the work in was the area in purple. We've since expanded that into the areas in orange and blue. So in the last sort of 2 years through our PEF project and our LAP WDP project, we've expanded that to 7 more drainage boards and worked really closely with the farms in there with a good level of uptake. And we're beginning, we'll move on to see some real data from that as well. So from the new drainage boards that we've been working with this year, these are the soil maps that have just been signed off in the last few weeks from the farms there. So you can see in some of the districts, not an awful lot of peat left. In others, significantly more shallow peat than what we were expecting, and we've gone along with this and collected ground truthing data at various intervals across the farms as well, which gives us a really clear idea of depth and condition and ground truths that data as well. These have then been turned into opportunity maps for those areas as well, and you can see that again, there are areas where peatland restoration or water table management or some of those alternative mitigations are likely to be a solution, but actually a lot of the Fens is falling into that we need to do something differently, but it's probably not going to be a water table management option, purely because we've got some challenges in terms of managing our hydrology to be able to do that. So yeah, to summarise, we found in this project and in the work that we've been doing with farms over the last couple of years that actually using local soils knowledge and local expert knowledge is a really valuable mechanism for working with farms to identify opportunities for land management and change within the Fens. So in terms of what we're doing next, we're still refining this methodology and making slight changes, but in whole we're happy with it now. So we're trying to roll it out to more drainage boards, so we'll be in touch to locate some new drainage boards to target for the next couple of years. And then we'll be carrying out some research into some of the more alternative mitigation that we need to fill in some of those gaps. So trying, as we sort of talked about earlier, moving into that, understanding our skirt soils and what we can do differently there to manage them. Thank you.
And I'd just like to say we're eternally grateful to the farmers who've cooperated with this, because quite often we have some money from the Environment Agency, we want to do mapping, but we haven't told the farmers in advance of that. And so they have been extremely cooperative. And I'd also like to thank Lucy and Christian, who are sitting here at the front, because they did the majority of this work. So now, Laurie, over to you.
First things first, get the microphones at my level. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak. Nearly 2 years ago, I stood up here and introduced the beginning of the Centre for Landscape Regeneration's project, which has part of its attention focused on the Fens. This is a Cambridge University project funded by the National Environment Research Council over 5 years. And so we're about 3 years in now, and those years have been mostly focused on the Fens and how you can actually put academic research behind all the sorts of practical considerations and hopes and fears that people have about how the land might develop in the future. And so what I've been asked to talk about this morning is what we alluded to just before coffee, which was how you actually make people play together nicely. And so here we go, let's see what happens. So the first question is, how do we identify key stakeholders in the Fens? How can we use mapping tools to actually get that working efficiently? Right, so key questions, if you're an academic, I think would boil down to, so how can we identify the key stakeholders? How do they interact? And how can we work most efficiently with them? And actually that doesn't give you a really practical recipe for how you might go about this, so you have to boil those down into real world questions, which I would say, who is working on what? With whom are they working? Sorry about the use of English there, a bit pedantry. And where are they working? So those are the three things that we boiled it down to. This is what we need to know. And 2 years ago, standing up here, I showed this, and it was grossly inadequate at the time, and it is still grossly inadequate now. This is my first take on the stakeholders in the Fens, and I based this just on the meetings that I went to with three key stakeholders, the Future Fens. So this is the Anglia Water Environment Agency Water Resources East project for the Fens. Natural Cambridgeshire, which gathers together all sorts of stakeholders of conservation, but also community and other aspects. And, of course, Fenland Soil, which was just starting, and was just starting to gather a lot of people around it. And going to the meetings of those three organisations, I met everybody else on this map. And so this map just shows 3 meetings worth of people, and the links actually show you how they link together. And you can see there's some people clearly not even linked into this because I gave up the unequal struggle of trying to link everybody in. So Robert Caldwell then stood up and said, what we really need is a map of everybody working in the Fens. So CLR took up the challenge, and I'm now going to tell you what happened. It's not a very pretty story. It hasn't gone terribly well, but I think it's important to say what hasn't gone well and why it hasn't gone well, and how we're going to try and fix it. Okay, so this is a story of not quite successful attempts. Right, so first of all, we decided to choose Kumu as a platform. This is free software. It's visually intuitive in that you can represent people or organisations as these little elements, as dots on a map, put their names on them, and you can connect them with lines that show who talks to whom, who does what with whom. And those connections can mean things. All of these things can carry data. You can put information behind each of these things so that when you click on them, you read about them. You have a very powerful search, so that you can use keywords. If you want to find out who's working on peat, you put in peat, everybody pops up who's working on peat. If you want to do permaculture, you can do that. And you can link through to websites and to maps from it. And the data can be uploaded to this from an Excel spreadsheet, but I hesitate to do that because I think that would be complete chaos. But you can download the data from it directly. Now, if Nigel would help me... Oh, thank you, Nigel. So I was really dreading that the web link wouldn't work. And so this is meant to be dynamic, but it's not going to be dynamic because I haven't got a link to the web. So I'm just going to point with the laser thing, and you have to imagine, I'm going to wave my arms around you, have to imagine what would happen if I clicked on these entities, okay? Right. So this is the map of the CLR team as it currently stands, and if you've seen this before, you'll realise that it's a whole host more complicated now than it was a couple of years ago. Right at the beginning, we had, I don't know, 20 senior members of staff of the university involved, each of whom were only giving about 5 or 10% of their time to the project, and some of them had postdocs and some of them had PhD students. And we've now got 14, 15, 16 departments of the university. So around here we've got the departments of the university, and linked to them are all the senior researchers, and linked to them are their postdocs. And this is, the structure of this is important. It's just structured on line management, so you go from the centre and you just say, who's linked to this by line management, by line management. It's a very simple linear structure. This is not what we're aiming for in the Fens because it's not a simple linear structure, but this is quite useful as a starting point. And if you go to just one of those dots and press on it, you'll find the website of the person there, and everybody they're linked to will pop up. If you go to the search over here, you just put in peat or permaculture, and a whole list of people will pop up, and you can then go and explore them. And on this left-hand side is where you store all the information, so you click on them, and this pops up, and you can see information. And you can put a URL there, and it'll take you through to the website and so on. So it's quite powerful in holding a lot of information. Thank you, Nigel. We can go on to the slides now. Right, so we decided we were going to make the map in this fashion. And the most useful way we thought we would approach it is to use some of our stakeholder friends to actually get the information. So we organised a workshop last summer. You can see there's quite a lot of time lapse between the start of this and getting through to the workshop in the summer. We gathered together some friends and just said, tell us what you want from the map. And then once we'd got all that, we thought we'll have the data, we'll put the data on one of these Kumu maps, we'll send the Kumu maps out to the people who came to the workshop and say, how's this? Is there anything missing? Can we do it better? And then we would update the map, and then we put it out to all of you and say, is this useful? Have you any more information from us? Please tell us, and then we'll update the map, and so on. And then you go into a sort of cycle of, sort of washing machine cycle here, where you get more and more information and you update things, and then you update them again and you update them again. So it has to be curated. So back to this map. Here's our stakeholder friends. So we gathered together people from various parts of this map who got together last July. Right. that's that. And they gave us some information. So the first thing first was, how will people use the map? So the only way to actually make a map that's actually going to work is to put yourself in the position of the person who wants the information out of the map. So what do you think that person's going to need? So we had a question and answer session about what will people want out of it. And people gave us completely different answers to that. Everybody wanted something different out of it. So we ended up by agreeing that everybody would be looking for keywords. So keywords are important. We thought that projects would be what people were looking for. So rather than thinking about an organisation like the Environment Agency and saying, okay, Environment Agency, what do you do? We could get thousands of answers to that, many of which are not actually relevant to future-proofing the Fens, which is what we're about here. So we thought we'd go for projects that are directed towards future-proofing the Fens, and then ask those projects who's involved in them. So that leads us to organisations, and tell us where you're working. And we decided that was the most effective way of gathering the data and actually putting it on the map. So this is what we're after. Key contacts, description, keywords, the URL of the website if it's got one, organisations, and the sites. And this is the first draft of the map that came out of the workshop, and it's already a complete and utter nightmare. Now, I have to tell you at this point that I'm working with systems engineers, so we've been talking about whole system approaches, and people who do that are, some of them, called systems engineers, and they have a great interest in how everything works, and if you change something over here, what will happen over there? So they seem to be the ideal people to work with. Now, my experience of that is that they're wonderful people, love them dearly, but actually their mind is in a different direction, so they're looking at the complexity of things, and how you express complexity in a way that an engineer would understand. But actually that's probably not what we need. So maps like this are way too complicated. And this is only about 50% of the data that we actually collected at the workshop. So if we put the other 50% in, every bit of information you put in multiplies the difficulty, not just adds to the difficulty, multiplies it. So this has got to change. And it's so out of control that it is not user-friendly, and it can't be user-friendly, so what do? I'll just tell you what happens when you do carry on. Here's just one project, okay, little things flown in there which circles the Fens Transition Lab. Some of you will have been involved in the Fens Transition Lab, which brought together a number of people to talk about how you might future-proof the Fens. So if you were to just look at the links here, you'd have a whole lot of links that are to do with farming and landowning and so on, and you'd have a whole lot of links to do with water, and I'm not putting in all the links, it's just a link to the general area of water, so you'd have 4 or 5 arrows from each of these boxes, or even more. You'd have those, and you'd have some of these, and you'd have some of those, and you'd have some of those. That's local government and all sorts of government departments. You'd have universities, and you'd have then the water people. I think it's water people who are last. So in order to actually fully express who's involved in that project, you'd have to have all those individually named organisations as a dot with a line from that dot to the project. And then you can imagine that all of those entities are intimately linked with other projects in other parts of the Fens. And many of the projects are called Fen this or Fen that or Fenland something else. And so it's really complicated. So we're going to go back to square one. We've tried this, it's a nightmare. So we're going to go back to square one. And so we're going to ask you for information. And based on the projects, we think this is the only way to do it. There's a URL, and there's this lovely QR code that you can photograph at some stage, and you can help us with a short questionnaire, which says, what's your project, who are you, what are you doing, where are you doing it, who are you doing it with, full stop. And then we will be putting together that map. And it's going to be something that is going to take a bit longer, let's put it that way. We are also aware of the project that's going on in the FFIA and Fens 2100 project to actually put together the Expo version with all the data in it. But this is aimed at your usage. It's not at the level of the high organisations, if you like. I keep going back to the Environment Agency because I can think of it immediately. Please don't feel persecuted, Environment Agency. But, you know, the Environment Agency has its own needs for a map like this. But I think all of us in this room also have needs to understand who else is working in the Fens, what they're working on, and how we can work with them and not fall over each other's feet. So let's make a user-friendly version of this, which is not so complicated that we can't use it, but is actually complicated enough that it's useful. And that is actually an academic problem, is working out where to stop making the map. How do you actually know when it's useful enough, but not so complicated that you can't use it? And it needs a long-term curator, so if anybody would like to volunteer, see me afterwards. Thank you very much.
Well, that was a good example of how things work sometimes and don't work. And you know, we all should engage with Laurie and the process. So, Brian, we now have you talking about soil carbon, net zero.
Okay, good morning everybody, and thanks for the opportunity to speak this morning. So I want to do a few things. One of them is to introduce a project, which is part of a much bigger package of projects. I want to give some insight into soil carbon and how soil carbon changes and the variation and variety in the shapes and forms that it comes in. Okay, so the talk today is called Soil Carbon Stocks under Land Use and Net Zero Futures, and this is basically work that's going to fold in behind a new project we've had funded from UKRI DEFRA called Open Lands. So the full title's on there, but basically the Open Land project is thinking about how if you change the landscape of the UK, where will the wins be and where will the losses be across that landscape. So I'm co-leading this project with Rachel Warren. Rachel Warren's a modeller, environmental modeller. She's worked for the IPCC on climatic modelling, biodiversity modelling, and for my part I'm aligned with the soil carbon flows and soil health part of the project, and together they basically meet to develop the project with an outline. Before I get on to that, little advertisements. We put a little piece out in the conversation. It's kind of a provocation. So if you're interested in Regen and what Regen might all be about and the mystery surrounding it, I'll just signpost you towards the Conversation UK and this article that ran last week. It should be interesting. Okay, so getting back to the Open Land project, it's basically broken down over 4 aims. So the first of those is to create and validate a UK-wide spatially explicit integrated modelling framework for Open Land, and that will evaluate potential net zero pathways for the UK. And then aim 2 is to upscale soil carbon and soil health empirical data to calibrate that model and to inform that Open Land framework across the UK. There's quite a lot of challenge around that, which I'll come back to in a minute or two. Aim 3 is to explore the synergies and trade-offs associated with alternative land use interventions. I guess more about that as well. And then aim 4, which is really aim 1, it starts right at the beginning, is to engage with farmer groups and academics and other stakeholders around what these net zero futures might look like. Okay, so this is kind of a simple example at a smaller scale. It's obviously not the UK. So we've got a long-standing relationship with Wendell Beck and Glenn Anderson and others. And basically we've got this vision to change about 800 hectares of land, which not so long ago looked like this, and in the future it's going to end up looking like this. And of course there's massive change there. The land is being used in a fundamentally different way. And of course one of the implications of going from here to here is food. There's less food, obviously. It's all nature. So the project is really about evaluating this. There'll be downscaled work for the project, which will be done for exemplar locations in different parts of the UK, but then the upscaling work will be a national picture. So I guess you kind of have to see this, that DEFRA's been involved in commissioning the work, and one of the things they want to know about is how much headspace do you have across the landscape to sequester carbon. So we have net zero trajectories, we're trying to meet ambitions to be net zero by whenever, to try and abate the climate change and the temperature increase and the sea level rises and all the rest of it. But the question persists, well, how much of an inroad can we make through changing the landscape? And that's what these projects are funded. So our particular project on here, basically, you don't have to worry about all the flows and diagrams, but the modelling part basically begins over here, which is where the last talk was facing, really, around land use interventions and scenarios for land use change. So we heard this morning from the Minister that there's a land use framework coming. We've been expecting this for a while, but we're not at a standing start. There's been UKCEH baseline land use scenarios which we've been working with and developing in the last couple of weeks, actually, with stakeholders. So the fundamental thought of this is creating a realistic vision of how the land might change. So it can't just be an academic vision of trees are marvellous for the sake of arguing, we'll have trees absolutely everywhere. That's not practical, it's not palatable, and it's not going to happen. So establishing land use scenarios that are actually actionable across the devolved governments for the different nations within the UK is right at the beginning, right at the core, which is why I said this aim one with stakeholders is really important to ensure that there's a connection, a hand-in-glove connection between the scenarios and what might translate on the ground. Beyond that, then, all the green bubbles on here are the modelling outputs. So it's not just about net zero and carbon the project's interested in. So the centre package is around biodiversity, and there'll be modelling work done by a range of partners from UBA, BTO, and CEH. And then down the bottom of the diagram, there's other outputs that are relevant as to how the hydrology will change under these landscape changes. And then over here, we've got crop modelling, which interfaces with food and food production. And then the green box over here under the scenarios around above ground carbon. So the bit that's missing in all that is the below ground soil carbon bit, which is a whole package all on its own that I'm going to move on to. But the point here is that it's not just a land use net zero future that the project's trying to grapple with and get numbers for. It's all these other outputs, the biodiversity, the food production, the hydrological change. And of course the thing that's driving all of it is the climate. And the climate will change, it will adapt going forwards. And so the models have to be cognizant to predicted climate change, which isn't a linear change. It changes in different ways in different spatial compartments across the UK. So it's a significant challenge to pull all the information together. Okay, so the soil half will be delivered by me. It's basically two parts to it. One was around the soil carbon stocks and flows, and the other was around soil health. Project's new, so there's lots of grey boxes on here. So all these people, the grey people down here, they're still to be appointed. But basically we're going to have researchers aligned to soil carbon characterisation under land use change scenarios, and then the big challenge, which I gave a nod to at the beginning, is this whole aspect of soil health. What is soil health? How do we measure soil health? And it's not a simple question to answer. So we hear people speak, say, oh, we're going to improve soil health. We need good soil health. We'll do this, this, and this. It'll improve the soil health. But fundamentally, it's intractable. Yeah, so earthworms, everyone, they love an earthworm or two. But you can't expect the same earthworm count in a dry, droughty, sandy soil as you might in a, I don't know, no water constrained, clay soil. And you can't expect those numbers of counts to be the same in the south of Italy, for the sake of argument, compared with the north of Scotland. Yeah? Everything's just pulling in different directions. It's a massive challenge. Okay, so the work package, I just want to outline what we're going to do, so we have interest to people. So the first bit is around these land use interventions. Now, I've said enough about that. The second bit is around soil carbon and soil health. The third bit on here is around robotics and sensors. I just want to briefly mention those. And then, if you want to look to the future, you need a model. So it's how do we integrate these measurements, both for soil carbon, stocks and flows, but also the health and the biota within the soil. How do you model that into a national and a downscaled vision of the future? And then the final thing is upscaling, looking nationwide and considering all the trade-offs of the scenarios that are being pushed forwards. Okay, so this is probably the main point of the talk, I would say. I think people don't really appreciate that soil carbon is not a one-size-fits-all, it's just how much carbon is there. It's absolutely not like that at all. Not all the carbon in the system is equal, as George Orwell might have it. And my analogy for this would be, you can have a buffet. The buffet's set out, and on the buffet you've got a choice. You get the cream scones, or you get the Brussels sprouts. I'm aware some people probably grow Brussels sprouts here, so no offence to those people. But given the choice, the cream scones are disappearing first. They're going off the table, they're delicious and fabulous. The raw Brussels sprouts, maybe once a year, will boil them up at my Christmas time. Anyhow. The science behind this, though, is, of course, that these residues, I'm using these food types as basically analogies for different sorts of carbon that are in the system. So at one side, we've got carbon here, which is fresh residues, dead crop residues, plant residues. And they're delicious and yummy, they're the cream scones, and they're really very degradable. On the other end, we've got the Brussels sprouts, which the caveat has already mentioned, are not so delicious, and they hang around for a long period of time. So of course this offers two opportunities here. The opportunity on the cream scone side is to prime the life in the soil and to build the soil health up because everything's nourished, the nutrition is high. On the Brussels sprout end of the spectrum is the other thing everyone's interested about, which is long-term carbon storage and the permanence of that carbon storage. Okay, so hopefully the analogy kind of works for everyone. Right, so how do we do this? So a little bit of science on here. So basically what we've kind of pulled together in this project is some prior work we've done around profiling stability of carbon in different soil and soil type materials. It's usually called TGA, it doesn't really matter what it's called, but basically what you do with the TGA is build a profile of the stability of carbon in a sample. So you're not just measuring the carbon content, you're asking a better question of how stable is the carbon in my sample. So on the left-hand side of the diagram, we've got relatively unstable carbon, on the right-hand side, we've got relatively stable carbon. So there's some science behind this, a bit of chemistry for everybody in the element, got an audience. If you look at simple molecules like cellulose and you put them through profiling, all that cellulose disappears at this low stability part of the profile. So the thing drops off quickly. And the stable part, well, it's really small for these simple cellulose biomolecules. If you look at something else, lignin, really complicated, much more interesting in chemistry, it's the sort of woody part of plants. And it's much more stable. And now the attrition doesn't really happen at the low stability part, the attrition happens in the high stability part. That's kind of what the project's getting at, because this ability to look at stability of carbon allows you then to make connections with long-term carbon storage and with the health that you might confer on the system by upregulating the labile cream scone carbon stocks. So if you profile the material, let's say compost for example, this is about as close as I'm going to get to Fenland peat today, and you can establish it's got half of it is organic carbon. Importantly, most of that is non-stable, and we know that from the profiling. This is kind of the issue with Fenland peat, that historically, we've heard about it earlier today, historically that peat has been lost, and the reason why it's been lost is because it's cream scone peat. It's great for soil health, but it's easy to consume, easy to degrade, and it turns into carbon dioxide. We lose the carbon store that was in the land, and we put the carbon store up into the atmosphere. So there's two things that are going completely in the wrong direction for what we want to do in terms of storing carbon and mitigating climate change. So there's a little bit of data from some work that we've been doing out at Gorgate, so looking at some regen blackcurrants. Basically the science is looking at how does the regen approach increase soil carbon stocks, and can we tease out whether or not it's the cream scones or the Brussels sprouts. So a little bit complicated diagram, I'll talk you through it slowly, relatively slowly. We've got control over here out of the field, and then we've got either an alley between the blackcurrants or a bush where the actual blackcurrants are. We've got increasing time from 1, 3, 5, 7 years of bush establishment. So if you look at the bottom part of the curve, this basically shows the labile carbon. It's easy to do, sorry, the recalcitrant carbon, the carbon is difficult to break down. And there's not really much shift in that carbon over a 7-year period. The top part of the graphs, it shows this labile carbon, and we're seeing it building under the bushes, but building a lot more in the alleyways in between. So what I've not got a slide for is the next part of the question is to how does the soil aggregate to physically stabilise those carbon assets and stocks? And the answer with regards to this work is that those labile carbon stocks that have been built under the regen system have been locked into stable soil aggregates that offer physical protection for that carbon. So on one hand, you might not have lots more stable carbon, but you've got labile carbon which is being protected by a restructured soil. Okay, so that might not be relevant to a Fenland system, which is just straight peat, but if you've got organomineral soils, this is really relevant. Okay, last couple of bits then, so soil modelling. The big questions on people's lips, regionally, your field, nationally, wherever it might be, is how long will the carbon persist, and can you assure some qualification on the permanence of that carbon storage? And people, this is market driven, people are really interested, people in the room are really interested about soil carbon credits and being able to trade those either to make revenue, income, farm, whatever, and to provide offsets into a supply chain, or indeed to inset on farm to produce carbon neutral food that then is more desirable in a supply chain marketplace. But to do that, the project will basically build out a fairly well established carbon fate model called the Roth C model. And importantly on here, there's 3 elements I want to highlight. So one of them is that we've got decomposable carbon, the other is we've got resistant carbon, and the last one is this humified carbon. So The cool thing on this is using the carbon stability profiling to provide values for these things on here to have a more robust model of carbon storage permanence rolling forward for the national assessments. Last couple of bits around robotics and sensors, going to ADP, local news. A couple of things we're going to do under the project. So, visually stored carbon stocks is tedious, it's laborious. Generally, it will involve pulling cores out of the ground, loads of them, a few cores for every 10 hectares or so, if that's how you do your assessment. There's other ways which the project's keen to get behind. So, gamma sensors are a good opportunity potentially, and these measure the potassium-40 signal coming out of the soil. And the amount of potassium-40, which is radioactive, so safe, don't panic, the amount of potassium correlates to the organic carbon stock that's in the soil. It needs in-field calibration. There's real opportunity around this to heat map fields for carbon assets and benchmark them with some physical samples. So Heap to do that and to use some robotics to take that technology platform forwards. And then the last thing I was going to mention is, again, some more state-of-the-art work. And I didn't say an awful lot about soil health, but I believe probably where we're going to make advance in this field is around eDNA and using molecular ecology approaches to look at assemblies of bacteria, fungi, soil animals potentially, which is beyond the curve at the moment. And these platforms basically allow you to take a sample of the DNA that's in an environmental sample, a soil sample, for the sake of argument, and basically to code all of the DNA that's there, and then refer that collection of millions of eDNA sequences against the library to work out a profile of diversity as to which organisms are living in that soil environment. And you know, we're in an age of AI, it's arrived, it's stuck up on us, but it's here, and the computer technology and the platforms to sift that data and to look for trends and patterns that link the distribution of those organisms, bacteria, fungi, whatever they might be, to soil carbon assets, the sort of carbon that's in the system, and to provide an elegant assessment of soil health is basically where the state-of-the-art is going to go, and part of the work the project's going to deliver. So, thank you. That's me.
Well, thank you. That was really interesting, and I know that you have a lot of work behind this, but it would be really good to see where this project goes in the future. So, Megan's talked about mapping, Laurie's talked about mapping in a different way, and Brian has talked about his new project on net zero. So I'd now like to ask Tom to tell us what he's learned from LandSmart.
Thank you very much, Tina. Well, I've sort of taken the opportunity, the title, if you like, of this thing about systems thinking to think about how Fenland farming, Fenland soil fits into the global environment system, global food system, the food and farming system within this country. And this is kind of the context of my book as well. So, LandSmart on sale in the foyer, got a card reader and will accept cash at lunchtime. So the reason I wrote this book was because I was kind of aware of so many people wanting to do so much with the land. So many different demands on land now, not just somewhere to grow our food and somewhere to rest our head, but space for nature, storing carbon, generating energy, growing industrial materials, water storage, recreation, mental health, roads, warehouses, and the like. A whole lot of people looking for so-called nature-based solutions. What do all these solutions have in common is that they need land. Now, at the heart of this is a particular dilemma, and at the heart of that are the Fens. Really, this place is crucial because two sort of titanic environmental truths clash in the Fens, and I'm going to outline those in a minute. And that's what makes this conference so important, that you've got one of the hardest global dilemmas. But if you solve it, or get even close to solving it, you've got a beacon for the world in this area. So that's why I think this is really so important. As I say, I'm going to talk about systems. Some people may think what I'm talking about is a bit superficial, particularly in comparison to my previous speakers. But here we go.
Can I do that in Brussels sprouts?
No sprouts in this one. In fact, I would eat them more often during the year as well. They're just never on sale. Okay, so the biggest issue we have in land use around the world for the environment is that more and more land is being taken from nature as wild land under the plough or under the cow. Since 1960 or so, somewhere in excess of 6 million square kilometres. If you want an idea how much that is, that's about 3/4 the size of Australia. Now, why is that bad in environmental terms? Because let's look at nature first. It's widely acknowledged that the kind of single worst thing you can do for the protection of wildlife and species is to take wild land into farming. IPBES, who are the organisation who are like the equivalent of the IPCC, but for nature, have land use change as their #1 threat to nature and wildlife. Let's look at climate change. Some of you may know this. Globally, farming and land use is thought to be responsible for around 1/4 of greenhouse gas emissions. Of that, more than half of that is actually not to do with the practice of farming, it's to do with land use change, as in taking land into farming. So I think one of the things we should really try and avoid around the world is taking more land under the plough and under the cow. Now, the logical result of that is you have to love where you farm already. You have to get as much, if not more, out of where you farm already, because you've got to feed not only the 8 billion or so that are here, but probably another 2 billion by 2050. So basically, farming is good, but not in new places for me. Let's have a look at what this means for the UK. Now, I borrowed, acknowledged this map of the National Food Strategy, Henry Dimbleby's work. I think he's going to be around later. Now, so credit to them. Apologies to the people of Orkney, who seem to have become attached to the UK. Now, it's easy to get confused by this map. This is a map of the proportion of land used for different things, not where these things happen. We don't all live in Wales, and not all inland water is in the Western Islands. But it gives you an idea of the proportion of land that's used for different things. And that is interesting of itself. It kind of gives you it makes you realise that around 2/3 of land is either used directly for animals, pasture, or to grow the foods that feed them. I'm actually more interested in this section here. This is the overseas land used to feed the UK. And as you can see here again, a big proportion of that is green. That's meat-based land. And if you actually put this area together, it's slightly greater than the area of the UK. It is my belief that we should be extremely careful, preferably don't, increase the size of this offshore island by pushing our food demand elsewhere. And it does worry me that in a lot of the studies and work from organisations like Natural England and the Climate Change Committee, for whom I have a lot of respect, and even some of the net zero stuff that Brian was talking about a moment ago, I'm not sure, well, I know from some of them, is I say to them, okay, that's great for net zero, that's great for the environment in the UK, have you looked at what the footprint would be on the rest of the world? Because when it comes to nature and climate, that really matters. And in some cases, the answer is no. Now, that's just not good enough. You know, we need, when it comes to these things, to be thinking about that, and that is why yield matters, and that is why the Fens matter, because you have simultaneously got the best place to grow food, pretty much, in terms of your ability to grow food, and pretty much the worst place to grow food in terms of your impact on the climate. So this is a really, really tough dilemma to be in. So, what can we do about this? Now, the people in this room have more answers than I do, but here's the famous home post, which shows you how much Fenland soil has been lost. They think about 4 metres or so of peat since, I think, 1800 or there and thereabouts. You can see it when you drive around on the roads here, the fields being lower than the roads. I went to a farm And he talked about how he built a barn that was at the level of the land, and 25 years later he has to drive up a ramp to get to the barn because the soil has vanished. So it's a really powerful example of carbon in the ground, literally going up into the air. So we kind of know the problem. What are the solutions? Well, a lot of the solutions, some of the people working on the solutions are in this room, and I should say that some of the inspiration from this book, from my book, came from when I was in this room 2 years ago and met a lot of interesting people, one of whom is just here, and this is John Shropshire. And one of the things that I like about John's approach is that he's thinking about it, and that's stage one. My book is called Land Smart for a good reason. I go out and meet people who I think are being smart about how you approach this problem. And that involves thinking of a lot of different things besides the just single monoculture. So, no, I mean, I don't think they have got all the answers, and John himself would say that they are still working on how to do this, but they're thinking about it, they're trying to find solutions, they're looking at the costs and benefits, they're looking at how they can still produce food, which he believes is very important, and so do I, whilst looking at the carbon emissions and what can be done to bring those two things together. One very simple solution I'm just going to put out there, and apologies to anybody who does this in the room: don't grow biofuels in the Fens, preferably don't grow them anywhere in my view. I think they're a pretty poor use of land. That's probably a separate topic, but they do get grown in the Fens, and I think that's a really bad idea. Here, some people may know this. If you want a radical answer, this is the Lapwing estate. James Brown up in Lincolnshire. Now, his reverse coal is a masterpiece in multifunctional land use, which is something I like a lot. So his idea, some of you may know this, is the wrong one. Sorry, is that you wet the peat, grow things like willow that will accept being grown in a very wet environment. You turn that, you pyrolyze that, so you turn it into charcoal, biochar in effect. Use the energy from that, the heat from that, to drive indoor farming, indoor food production. You put the biochar in the ground as a carbon store. As we know, I think biochar would rate as pretty durable, or recalcitrant, I think in your word, recalcitrant carbon. And so you've got a way of still producing food whilst locking up carbon whilst being on the Fens, and to add multifunctional facets to it, you can also make it a floodwater storage area, because it doesn't matter if it gets wet in times of high rainfall. Now, this is pretty ambitious and it requires a lot of investment, but what I'm saying is I think it's an example of some of the smart thinking that's out there, and he's recently received some government funding for this, and I know he's got big plans for what to do. So the other thing I think we should bear in mind when it comes to systems is we shouldn't necessarily assume that the current system, that the current food system is necessarily unchangeable, is necessarily where we're always going to be. And I think it's worth putting this in some sort of context. Oh, excuse me, I'm just going to slightly jump the gun there. This, one of the answers, which we talked about a lot today, and I shan't go over a lot, regen farming. This is Tim Carton, regen farmer featured in my book. Very sad to say, since I talked to him, since this picture was taken, he had a very nasty farming accident, but he is still extremely active in promoting regenerative agriculture and doing what he can on his farm. But regen, I think, is one of the big solutions if you can, the trick is to do the regen whilst minimising or eliminating the yield trough that you go through while you transition to a regen system. A lot of regen farmers will tell me that you can get there to as good, if not better, and certainly more durable and sustainable yields, but you will have a trough in the meantime. You talked about the definition, whether it's a waffly term. I actually think it's quite straightforward. It is open-sided and it is open to abuse, because some people will bring other things into it. In a sense, the clue is in the word regeneration. It's about leaving your farm, principally your soil, in a better condition next year than it was the year before. It is regenerative. How you do that, kind of up to you. And I quite like it. As I was mentioning, just a couple of things about systems. Why have I got a picture of the Western Isles up here? we assume our current food our current food system assumes that you can do nothing with growing food in these lands apart from graze the occasional sheep. If you actually look back in history, or indeed look back at a little patch in a garden up there, those are potatoes. I grew kilos of potatoes off an area merely twice the size of that table, with a bit of seaweed, yes. And they used to, in the past, grow a lot of food in these places. Now, I am not suggesting that we are going to grow, large percentages of food in places like that. My point is, there used to be a much more diverse source of where our food comes from, and we weren't resting so heavily on places where it's highly productive, and if John will forgive me, quite easy to grow food. We used to grow it in more challenging places, and I don't necessarily think the way we currently do it today is set in stone. Another place that we can grow a lot of food is our gardens. And people, once again, used to do this, have done this. There is a lot of potential to do this. And particularly in the sort of salad vegetable area, has a lot of, a lot of potential. This guy grows 50 different edible plants in his front yard in Newcastle. And you can do a lot with it. And so once again, this idea that it's set in stone, I disagree with. At times of, we've usually associated home growing with times of crisis, wars, etc., etc. Now that's the other thing that could change things. We assume that our current food system will maintain. A lot of experts think it's extremely vulnerable to climate change, trade wars, actual wars, and just a whole lot of things that could lead to it being much more restricted, and I think that could change the way we think. It might drive a demand for domestic security, but as we know, domestic security is a little bit of an illusion in terms of food security, because as we know, we can all have a terrible weather year here. That's the time when you need good trade as well. The other biggest systems thing to think about is our diet. And there are a lot of people who say we could re-wet and re-wild the fens tomorrow and move our farming around if we ate less, full stop. We generally globally eat too much. We waste less, famously. Have you calculated between a third, a quarter of our food is wasted? And of course, finally, and possibly most controversially, eat less meat, because meat is a very inefficient way of turning land area into food. Now, whilst all those things are basically true, behavioural change is one of the hardest things to achieve. And it's very, very easy to achieve for those who already made the change, whatever that change would be. Nevertheless, I think this should be borne in mind as the system in which all this farming and food operates is the food demand system as it is at the moment. And that is also changeable, I think. So just as a final thought, there are two sort of guiding principles in my book, and that I kind of stick by. One is that we should, where possible, we should use land for more than one thing at once. Multifunctioning land, I think, is a really, really good idea. And in the past, this has been rather kind of, I think, rather sort of unhelpfully boiled down to either sharing or sparing. There are many ways in which land can do more than one thing at once. There are plenty of arable farmers who are building up their carbon stocks in the soil, so they are producing food and they are storing carbon. You can, for instance, do a lot with energy. If you have wind turbines on your land, you are producing energy and you are growing food. Other places you might be providing wildlife and growing food. I think multifunctioning land is a really, really interesting approach, and often can be done without particularly undermining any of the products you're producing. So I think that is one of them. And the other thing is to do things smartly. And I end with a kind of ringing endorsement for agricultural and land-based education, because people have had a bit of a sneery attitude to it in the past, and that is totally wrong. We need to bear in mind that this is, very, very important stuff, and we need to get government funding for it, we need to get universities, we need to get businesses, we need to get everyone behind the fact that being clever about your land and using it for a multitude of things is really, really important. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Tom. I think we've got quite a selection of views here, and I wonder. So I have one question. So, who should be developing a new approach to managing lowland agricultural peat? Should it come from top down or bottom up, or a combination of both?
Kind of feel obliged to take that one first, I think. So obviously, as an organisation, Fens will advocate for a bottom-up approach. We think that if you're going to make large-scale change and you're going to encourage people to actually go with that change, then it's better that they design it themselves. So hence the work we've been doing, sort of working with landowners to develop our mosaic options. So yeah, that's my thoughts. I think it definitely needs to be bottom-up, but I'll pass to the other panellists for their opinion.
Just quickly, I think it probably has to be both. I mean, that's really why the government land use framework, which was mentioned, is due out on Friday-ish. That's why they think they need a framework. However, and I think they're genuine about this, they are very aware of the danger of coming over as a bit Stalinist in this. You will grow this there and you will grow that there. And so the chats I've had them about this is that the consultation period in this really means something, is really important, because they do want to hear from the ground up, and quite how bold it is remains to be seen.
Well, it's good to see that the new government is actually publishing this land use framework, because I've been in various conversations where civil servants have said it will never happen because they were too afraid of the top-down approach. So Brian, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think that the figure that Tom put up, the Dunbley figure, that's really helpful, because it doesn't assign a particular commodity thing that we need, a particular grid cell. And I think that's the whole point of creating these scenarios, that provides a way to run an account as to, if we did this amount of this and this amount of that, this is where we would end up, and that's a benchmark to decide if that's good enough, if we travelled far enough down the road. But to make it actionable, people need to change, and they have to want to change, or the incentives and levers to encourage them to change need to be in place to do it, to deliver it. But I think it'd be foolhardy to produce a map and colour in all the little grid squares and say, you've got to do this, guys. That won't work.
Yeah, well, it'd be interesting to see what comes out.
Yeah, I think as soon as you have a map and you colour it in, then that's really the recipe for disaster. So I think there's a real, especially the one that Tom showed us at the beginning, the Orkneys joined to Scotland. I don't know what I think about that. But yeah, you can set out a framework that says a percentage of your land should be this, your percentage of your land should be that. But if you were to say it's this field, that field, then immediately those owners of those fields are going to say, not my dead body and so on. So I think there has to be a complete partnership between bottom up and top down in this, with a lot of leeway given to those bottom up, the people who actually manage the land, own the land, make their living from the land. Give them a lot of agency in how that's actually worked out, but give them a framework within which they can work.
Good, thank you. Any questions from the audience? Oh, come on, surely. Julius.
Thank you. So I think probably a question for Brian. Picking up on your not all carbon is equal, fantastic. And you talked about the labile carbon becoming structurally secured. Christine Jones in Australia talks a lot about the relative carbon capture efficiency of biomass compared to plant root exudates. Is that a concept where you've seen evidence of here at all, and is that something, an emphasis we could be developing?
Yeah, so I think scientifically, my take is that the exudates themselves might not be the whole story. those exudates, they prime a rhizosphere. And if you can build in particular fungal biomass in a rhizosphere, it's that biomass that will lock more carbon rather than the exudates that's encouraging that to happen. And it's probably a better way to think of it. And a lot of the regenerative actions you might take often serve not to disturb the soil, which will help those fungal hyphae communities to develop. So there's kind of those two things pull in the same direction. I mean, to put a little bit more detail on it, there's interesting work going on at Earlham Institute in Norwich where you ask the question, what happens as you increase carbon dioxide levels? How do the plants respond? And of course, they think that's fabulous because they can make more biomass because there's more carbon to remove. And then they create more roots and they create more exudates, and there's actually not a complete self-regulation or righting of the ship, but it's not as simple as just the CO2 goes up and nothing happens in response.
Thank you. Yes, I think Christine talked about the exudates into sort of biological diverse and rich soils being converted into humus, as long as there's enough nitrogen in the mix, organic nitrogen. Is that
good soil binders as well? They're going to help the aggregation.
So it is correct that we can convert labile carbon into more stable carbon. I don't know whether you still call it label or you've got another label for it.
Yeah, physically protected might be a turn of phrase.
Thank you.
Just behind you.
Thank you, Tina. Building, I think, on Laurie's comment about filling in the map, it's just made me think a lot about SFI, and I think SFI has been brilliant, much more complicated than a lot of these incentives to look at the environment as well as the farm. But the one thing that I think has always been missing is to look at what the farmers are already doing, and I know it would be almost impossible to put such a scheme in place, but if a farmer were able to write a little essay, this is what I've done on my farm, and in general it is a really great regenerative, sustainable approach, rather than having to say, you know, I've put in the fence and I've dug a ditch and I've planted some trees. And I just wonder whether any of you have an opinion on that, perhaps Laurie first, whether such a scheme could be sort of put as a possibility to government. It's a shame that Daniel has gone, to enable a more complex, holistic way of looking at a regenerative farming system.
Have a go at that, but I think it's really Megan's question. But yes, absolutely. Have you come across conservation evidence, the project? Because this is something that our colleagues in the Centre for Landscape Regeneration do, which is to gather information from practitioners and just say, what are you doing and what effect did it have? Did it work? Going back to this, you have to report your failures as well as your successes, otherwise people will just go down and do the same thing again and find that it doesn't work. So I think there's really great potential for a sort of network of information about what people do and so on. And that can also then lead into the opportunity mapping idea that we have a number of farmers who do this and it works and they're all in the Fens or they're not in the Fens and so on. So maybe over to Megan.
Thank you. Yeah, I think a lot of the sort of the stuff around SFI will probably cover off a little bit tomorrow, but sort of the comment on, I guess, results-based payments is probably what you were getting at. I think we'll cover that off quite a lot with Doug's session tomorrow, actually, and Doug might want to come in with a comment on this after me. But it's definitely something that we need to consider because at the moment you're definitely not rewarded for being an early adopter of a lot of this stuff. And I think that's one of the major challenges we've got in terms of getting people incentivised to start making changes now rather than waiting, is that actually at the moment things don't massively stack up well. If you're already doing actions then you can't be paid for them, and actually we need to have a look at that system and see if there's a fairer way of actually making sure that if you are an early adopter you're not losing out by doing so.
I'm just going to say exactly what they call the prodigal son problem, which is that you reward the person who's been trashing the land. And in fact, I've seen some people who say that if they see it coming in 2 years' time, they'll make sure the soils need to remove as much carbon as possible in 2 years. Because then they can build it up more rapidly after that. So I think it's a real danger in terms of how you frame the incentive.
Does anyone want to challenge Tom on the biomass?
I can unpack it a bit if you want.
Yeah, I do.
Well, I mean, by if your idea is to make energy out of land, either put a wind turbine up or put some solar panels on. Because they are orders of magnitude, and we're talking anywhere between sort of 50 to 500 times more kilowatts per metre squared from those things than you would get from a crop. So I just think, and that's before you get to the problem of the whole slightly dubious climate benefit, or more than slightly, highly dubious climate benefits of a lot of biofuels anyway, by the time you've looked at soil disturbance, fuel, transport, conversion, etc., etc. So my book is fairly polemic, but I make an exception for biofuels, of which I'm not a big fan, as you can tell.
So you don't think it has a place in a rotation?
Not really, no. I'm sure there are other things you can do that put something in that rotation that would be better.
Okay, Luke's going to.
Sorry, I'd love to agree with you, Tom. Really would love to agree with you. I've been a staunch opposer to having energy crops on our farm for many, many years, due to the fact of what you're mentioning. But with the government reducing our single farm payment to next to nothing, national insurance going up, we've had to take a long, hard look at what crops we can physically grow on our farm to make a return. Energy crops give us a guaranteed income, and a lot of Fenland farmers around here are relying on a stable income to allow them to do this. Now, it's been government policy to fund these ridiculous things that you're talking about, to allow them to actually come in and increase rents to make us not as competitive against these things. But intrinsically, the one thing that they are doing is bringing in digestate from them, which is reducing our reliance on inorganic P&K that's coming across. So there are some benefits. I'm not going to say there are a lot of benefits. It infuriates me that I'm saying this, actually. But, you know, because we've lost this safety net, we have to have a diverse range of crops. And the other issue is as well, you go to a bank manager and say, do you know what, I'm going to grow 1,000 acres of potatoes. I'm completely nuts. I need at least 40 million pounds. Are you going to give it to me? There might be a 2% return on that. Never going to happen. So what these digesters have actually allowed us to do is give a safety net. It's probably in the wrong place. And when you talk about solar panels and wind turbines, the Fens are actually full now of solar and wind turbines. What we have a real problem with is the national infrastructure not having the ability for grid connections. Something called resonance happens. So there are cables flying all over East Anglia trying to connect to the last available point. You then also get the other point within solar panels of, in the height of summer, they actually turn them off because there's too much electric being produced. So I'm going massively off point, but I apologise. My point is this: energy production in this country needs a massive shake-up because we can produce it, we just cannot store it. And we are so punch-drunk thinking that we have got the ability to use it at so many points. We don't. We need to be able to move the electric in a far better way and store it, whether it's converting it to hydrogen or whether it's actually converting it to battery storage. We have electric at the wrong time of year.
To come out very quickly on a couple of those. I mean, a smart person may have noticed actually there was some biofuel in my talk, because the guy on Lapwing Estates is actually growing willow to turn into biochar and making fuel out of it. So you know, that's a very limited exception. You're right, commercially you're absolutely right, but I mean the incentives we've got for biofuels I think are totally wrong. I think most of them were developed, particularly with AD, the public were told this was a use of waste, and then it turns out that most of it is virgin crop. I think that's verging on a mis-selling scandal in terms of how it was put to the public. You couldn't be more right. But it's another government policy thing in terms of the grid and connections. You know, in my view, not those of the BBC or any others, but they should have spent 80 billion on the grid rather than HS2.
Well, on that note, I think we need to have lunch. And